Did you know that John Carpenter has an unofficial trilogy of films? While none of them are connected, his Apocalypse trilogy features 3 films that deal with characters having their faith in humanity, religion, and reality tested. 1982's The Thing is the most popular of the trilogy, featuring a research team fighting an alien who was unthawed from a 100,000-year sleep that has the ability to shapeshift into members of the team. 1987's Prince of Darkness has a group of graduate students and professors who are investigating a mysterious liquid contained in an ancient container. The liquid turns out to be Satan himself, who is trying to break free and enter the physical world. 1994's In the Mouth of Madness deals with John Trent, who is investigating the disappearance of famed horror author Sutter Kane. And the line between the fictional world of Sutter Kane's books and our reality start to blur. Despite his hatred of it, John Carpenter is most known for giving birth to the Halloween franchise. I'm very biased towards Halloween, it's my favorite film of all time, but if it wasn't for my biased opinion, In the Mouth of Madness has a very strong case for being Carpenter's best work in my opinion. I've always had a love for horror movies involving a weird town, like in Halloween 3, The Wicker Man, or Dead and Buried. Hobb's End in the Mouth of Madness is no exception. There's a long history of John Carpenter movies flopping upon release and finding an audience upon video release. It's almost like that's just how a Carpenter movie goes. No one sees it, then years later people are like, oh yeah, that one John Carpenter movie that no one saw is actually really good. I'm sure it's happened to other directors too, but it's so weird that it happens with his movies so much. The title of this film is a play on the title of H.P. Lovecraft's novella, At the Mountains of Madness. And Lovecraft's influence is all over this film, which we'll discuss as we go on. Very similar to how Wes Craven's meta film Scream assumes its audience knows horror cliches, In the Mouth of Madness kind of assumes that the audience is familiar with the works of Lovecraft and Stephen King. Fortunately, the movie still works if you aren't familiar, so don't worry. Michael DeLuca, who wrote 7 episodes of the series Freddy's Nightmares and the film Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare, originally wrote the script for In the Mouth of Madness in the 1980s, and it was almost immediately offered to John Carpenter, who turned it down. Tony Randall, who directed Hellraiser 2, was chosen to direct in 1989, and when that fell apart, director of Pet Sematary 1 and 2, Mary Lambert, was chosen, which honestly isn't a bad choice. I don't think it would have turned out as good as it did, but I would have liked to see her vision of this. It's also a good time for a quick plug for Pet Sematary 2. I actually really love that movie, and I think it's even better than the original. So finally, John Carpenter was brought on to direct, fresh off the disastrous release of Memoirs of an Invisible Man. It's kind of funny how almost everything Carpenter made after Memoirs wasn't too well received, and then there's just this masterpiece that is In the Mouth of Madness, just kind of thrown in there. So anyway, I want everyone to grab your favorite Sutter Kane book. There are 7 of them, so choose wisely. Let's throw on some knockoff Metallica, and let's delve into In the Mouth of Madness. So it's no secret that John Carpenter is not only one of the greatest horror directors of all time, but a mastermind when it comes to scoring films. Originally, he wanted Enter Sandman by Metallica to play over the opening credits. It was probably a financial decision to not get the rights for the song, so John Carpenter, Tim Lang, and Dave Davies created the greatest Enter Sandman ripoff you'll ever hear, and it's great. Someone on YouTube made a fan edit with Enter Sandman over the intro, and I think it works, but I think there's something hilariously great about them just being like, hey, we can't get the rights, so we'll just do it ourselves. John Carpenter has this great I don't give a fuck attitude about everything, and I love it. I remember seeing an interview before where he talks about his movies being remade, and he just didn't care as long as he got a nice check for it. So we're watching the mass printing of Sutter Kane's books. Specifically his newest book, The Hobb's End Horror, which is the 6th of soon-to-be 7 books. In total, we have Whisperer in the Dark, The Thing in the Basement, The Feeding, Haunter Out of Time, The Breathing Tunnel, The Hobb's End Horror, and his final book, In the Mouth of Madness. Some titles are a nod to H.P. Lovecraft's books like The Whisperer in Darkness and The Shadow Out of Time. I've always loved the attention to detail when it comes to the artwork of these books. It's like that kind of Stephen King type artwork from the 80s and 90s. Like, I'm genuinely disappointed that some of these books don't exist. We get a glimpse of what's going on in The Hobb's End Horror. It says something about this town doesn't seem quite right. Something which is making Carl sick to his stomach. Something which is changing his wife. John Carpenter, you got me. Please let me read these books. I also love the He's Back above Sutter Kane's name. I mentioned Stephen King earlier because he's very clearly an inspiration for Sutter Kane, which is funny because Stephen King is mentioned and exists in this universe. In hindsight, what may seem like just an opening that shows the books being created is actually the creation of the end and is kind of haunting upon rewatching the movie. Our movie starts kinda at the end. Our main character, John Trent, played by Sam Neill, who said this is actually one of his favorite films that he's acted in, is being locked away in a psychiatric hospital. He apologizes for the balls, claiming it was a lucky shot. John screams that he's not insane, leading to all the other patients screaming the same thing. So remember how I just said we start at the end? Well, a dark figure appears in John's room and tells him that this isn't the end. He hasn't read it yet. There was a weird trend in the 90s where movies had like hard flash cuts with glimpses of things that happen later on in the movie. A trend I'm not a fan of, but it's just a product of the time. Dr. Wren, played by David Warner, arrives to meet with John. They've been monitoring all admissions through police and paramedic channels, and they think that John has the symptoms of them, which we'll come to find out what that means. The bit of foreshadowing here by Wren and Saperstein gives us a glimpse of how crazy things have actually gotten in the world. Saperstein even says that if Wren is here, things must be bad. John asked for a single black crayon, and somehow managed to draw all over the walls, his clothes, and himself with it without breaking or running out. It's pretty impressive. I like the hints that John is schizophrenic, and whatever is happening in the world isn't even real, saying that Dr. Wren wants to hear about his them, kind of like how Donnie Darko teases the mental illness aspect before revealing that the events actually happen. John is a freelance insurance investigator and was working for a firm in the same city. This whole mess started with the Sutter Kane disappearance. We jump back in time to the actual movie, and we see just how good John is at his insurance investigator job when he reveals that this man actually burnt down his own warehouse. He has photos of this man's wife wearing clothing that he claimed was destroyed in the fire. Not only that, but his mistress is wearing the same clothes too. So I love that there are Sutter Kane signs even on buses. We see an ad for In the Mouth of Madness saying, "You'll go mad with fear." Also worth noting that I love how meta it gets in promoting a book inside of the movie with the same name. The mid-90s were just a great time for meta horror films. Like I said, we learned just how good John Trent is at his job. Robbie claims that most of his employees wouldn't be able to sniff out a phony claim if their noses were nailed to it. I love the shot of John and Robbie's conversation, how we see a maniac with an axe just walking out of the video store across the street. So Robbie has tried to hire John to investigate the disappearance of Sutter Kane. The guy armed with an axe breaks the window to the diner targeting John and asks him, "Do you read Sutter Kane?" The voice this actor uses sounds like the perfect voice for TV advertisements, which I'm not sure if it's intentional or not. I like to think that he just kind of adapted the traits of an advertiser to get more eyes on Kane's work. His pupils have split in two, and he looks just very inhuman. The police are able to gun him down before he kills John. We later find out that this man was actually Sutter Kane's agent, who was actually the last person to hear from Kane a couple weeks ago when Kane mailed him a couple chapters of his newest book without any return address. So whatever was written in those chapters seems to have made his agent turn into a murderous lunatic. A news report also shows that Sutter Kane is having some weird effect on his audience, including riots, because stores aren't able to keep up with the demand for pre-orders for his book In the Mouth of Madness. When does fiction become religion is an interesting question that the news anchor asks us. It helps us understand the vast reach of Sutter Kane's works. At what point would it become dangerous? We get some close-up shots of the monsters from his books, which is our first cue that even though Sutter Kane's name is based off of Stephen King, his work is heavily based off of H.P. Lovecraft instead. I mean, this is literally Cthulhu. Charlton Heston being in this movie kind of caught me off guard for some reason. He plays Jackson Harlow at the publishing company Arcane. Linda Stiles, played by Julie Carmen, is offended that John doesn't read books and dismisses Kane as a horror writer. She says that he's the century's most widely read author, even outselling Stephen King. I love the idea of walking into a bookstore and just seeing Sutter Kane and Stephen King's identical work right next to each other. John Trent's character kind of seems like he's in the wrong movie. He lights up a cigarette right in the office, as if he's in like a noir from the 1940s before Linda hints that he puts it out. I choose to believe that reality is warped by Sutter Kane because his favorite color is blue, and I'll explain this later on in the movie, so stay with me. Once he finds out that the axe handler was actually Kane's agent, he offends Linda yet again by saying that Sutter Kane should have had better representation. So he's just kind of striking out left and right here. He's just this smart-ass ignorant guy in the wrong movie, and I love his character for that. We find out that the studio already sold the film rights for In the Mouth of Madness, despite not having the entire book due to Kane's disappearance. John Trent starts to believe this whole thing is a publicity stunt, despite seeing a man murdered right in front of him. Linda reveals that Kane's work has an effect on his less stable readers, like paranoia and memory loss. The idea that fictional work could lead to people acting insane isn't too far-fetched, In 1988, a high school student was inspired by Stephen King's book Rage to take his high school class hostage. Catcher in the Rye has been connected to murders. Charles Manson claimed that songs by the Beatles were predicting a race war. But what's so haunting about In the Mouth of Madness is that it's a large majority of people who are involved in this hysteria and not just like one small group or one person. So much like a noir film, John Trent attempts to hit on the young damsel, using the job as a way of getting close to her. If you're aware of John Carpenter's filmography, I have a strong feeling if this movie was made like 10 or 15 years earlier, it would have starred Tom Atkins, and he would have been chasing after the young girl. I mean, he did it in both The Fog and Halloween 3. So Linda says that Sutter Kane's works became much more bizarre recently before his disappearance, and he became convinced that his own writing was real, which later on we'll learn to be true. But she wants to know if he's alive or dead because his fans are getting restless. So instead of putting out a statement like, hey, the book is delayed due to whatever, she just demands that they go find him. John Trent has such a dark mindset, earlier saying that he expects the worst out of people, and here he tells Linda that we fucked up the air, the water, each other, so we should just finish off by flushing our brains down the toilet. John Carpenter has always done a good job at putting some political and social commentary in his films without it being like this big overbearing message. They Live speaks for itself because that's the most obvious one. Halloween 3 draws attention to TV and commercialism. In Assault on Precinct 13, Carpenter wanted to develop a friendship between a white convict and a black cop. The Fog is about colonialism. There are more, but it's a whole different discussion entirely. Someday I might delve into They Live if it's actually worth the political discussion that will come from it, but we'll see. So speaking of police, after Linda tells John to read some of Sutter Kane's books, he witnesses a police officer attacking some would-be graffiti artist who started writing "I can see" on a wall. It's worth noting that the posters that John finds for the Hobbs End horror have some red lines on them that will be important later on. John reports back to Robbie that this whole thing is just a scam and people going nuts is just mass hysteria, but I do love the hesitation in Sam Neill's voice as if he really doesn't believe what he's saying. So John goes into a bookstore and there's actually a very surprising amount of Sutter Kane books considering people are rioting in the streets over his books. While shopping, some kid comes up to John and tells him, "He sees you." John replies, "Tell him I said hi," which just bravo for this perfectly written sarcasm. John reports back to Robbie again as he's reading the books and says, "They're not really anything special, slimy things in the dark, people go mad and turn into monsters." But what's important is he says that his writing has a way of getting to you, so he actually is beginning to understand the mythos around Kane's writing. The slimy monsters and people going mad once again point to the works of Lovecraft. John ends up having a dream when he falls asleep reading a book where he's back in the alley where the cop was. This time, the cop is mutated into this monster-looking thing. Kane's agent and some of his followers arrive in the alley and tell him he sees you. The cop then chops the agent up with an axe and eats pieces of his flesh. I tried to find something about this Heritage and Culture Week sign that's up here, but I couldn't find anything, so I'm not sure if it's important or not. John wakes up, and there's a great jump scare here where the police officer is sitting next to him revealing that he's still dreaming, and then he actually wakes up for a second time. Something clicks in John where he realizes that all of the book covers have this red streak that I mentioned earlier. He cuts them and pieces them together, and they form the entire state of New Hampshire, coincidentally right next to Stephen King's favorite state of Maine. There is a red dot in the middle of the state which John suspects is Hobbs End, the fictional town from Kane's book. So Hobbs End is a real place in a real state. Hobbs End is also the subway station from Quatermass and the Pit, which John Carpenter is a huge fan of. John Trent confronts Jackson Harlow about the puzzle and originally thinks it's part of a contest they would run, then suspects that this whole thing is just bullshit and wants to go to Hobbs End. Jackson also has this painting of this Lovecraft-type monster hanging up in his office, so the hints of what's to come are right in front of the character's face. So Linda gets volunteered to go on this hunt too. I guess I never really noticed how similar this movie is to Halloween 3. I enjoy this bit of comedic relief where John wakes Linda up in the car by honking a horn. She throws chips at him and he delivers advice that I want all of us to take with us everywhere we go. Never, never, never throw chips at a driver. This is a good time to point out that Sam Neill originally took this role as a comedy role, and he acts that way in a lot of parts. Not that it's necessarily funny, but the movie gets so over the top that it's funny, if that makes sense. This whole car scene where characters are just talking in a car has also become a staple in John Carpenter films. It's in about 7 of them. I also like how Linda is like the realistic one here who thinks this whole trip is nonsense and Hobbs End isn't a real place. We get some character growth in the car ride. Linda reveals that she is actually scared of Kane's work. And when John says it's not real, She says that reality shares his point of view, but what would happen if reality shared Sutter Kane's point of view? As we push on, it's important to remember that Sutter Kane's writing is indeed shaping this universe, therefore becoming our reality. Hence the whole business about In the Mouth of Madness coming soon, and the book was going to be turned into a movie. So, meta stuff. Linda says that if insane people became the majority, then sane and insane would switch places. Insane would be our new norm. People who are normal like John would end up in a padded cell wondering what happened to the world, which we've seen is where John will eventually end up. So this is one of my favorite scenes in the movie. Linda takes over driving and sees a kid riding a bike in the dead of night. As they keep driving, she sees an old man driving towards her on a bike. The creepy old guy is actually played by John Carpenter himself, and it's shot in like this really creepy way as if you're just a kid sitting in the back seat of a car as you pass by something very quickly. Then Linda goes to check the map, and somehow the old guy got in front of the car and she hits him. When the kid passed by earlier, we saw that there were cards in the wheel on his bike, and it's revealed the old guy had the same cards on the same bike, so we're dealing with some kind of weird time loop thing going on. The old man has the voice of a younger kid and yells, "He won't let me out," before getting up and going on his way. Just one of my favorite jump scares ever, and it has this weird like David Lynch vibe all over it. It's great. I get Lost Highway vibes from this whole driving scene, but that came out a couple years after this movie. It's confirmed that there is indeed some kind of time loop here because Linda drives over a bridge. It's shown that she's driving either upside down or in the clouds, then comes out of the tunnel in Hobb's End in the daytime, despite the clock just showing 1:41 a.m. What a lovely trip. The streets are quiet. No one seems to be around, except Linda sees a cute dog and a bunch of kids pile into the street, but when John looks, they've all vanished. Most of the exterior of Hobb's End was shot in Unionville, which is just outside of Toronto. It's like one of those small towns where you just feel like you can't trust the residents because everything seems too perfect. Linda knew about a hotel in the town where one night one of the townspeople saw something enormous growing in this room with arms like snakes. And if that sounds unrealistic for the reality that they've established, it's because it's from the book Hobb's End Horror. So everything from the book, the Hobb's End Horror, actually does exist. This is confirmed when Linda points out a painting and a loose board on the floor from the book. John says that this is all just a tourist attraction. Mrs. Pickman, the employee at the hotel, who is named after the Lovecraft story, Pickman's Model, finds it weird that John says the hotel is famous, and when he mentions Sutter Kane, she does not recognize the name. Linda sees the painting on the wall move and comes to the conclusion that they are living within a Sutter Kane story. John disagrees because in the book, Mrs. Pickman is a lunatic who chops up her husband. I love how John is trying to prove that Kane's books aren't real by saying, out the window there should be a church. But Linda corrects him and says he got the wrong window. And out the right window is the exact same church that he is referring to. It's like the beginning of a slow descent into madness for John. So when they approach the church, John reads the book and says it's like a guidebook. He reads, "This place had once been the seat of an evil older than mankind and wider than the known universe. It was a place of pain and suffering beyond human understanding," which is actually a line from Lovecraft's works. The book also says there's a mosaic of our Lord above the front door, which there actually is. The Lovecraft influence ramps up from here because it mentions an old church was swallowed and nothing remains. Some believe it still exists, and its inhabitants were a murderous race of creatures who could contaminate time itself. Delving into Lovecraft's work is a whole different task entirely, but to keep it short, his monsters like Cthulhu are known to drive people insane at the sight of them. They're an ancient evil, older than humanity itself, and are beyond our understanding, like the monsters of Sutter Kane's works. The windows on the church also feature a battle for heaven, where the Archangel Michael is fighting a creature from the other side. A mob of angry parents show up to the church, demanding that Kane give their children back. It's a lovely touch to feature on the door a sign saying anyone who enters will be damned forever. The door slams, revealing a child, and then opens to Sutter Kane himself, played by Jürgen Prochnow. Kane summons Dobermans that are unleashed on the mob. I love John's constant claims that this whole thing is staged, but in a twist it's revealed that he is kind of half right. Linda says that Kane was sent away on a publicity stunt, but he never actually showed up. Harglow sent her with John, and they weren't supposed to find anything, but what they're actually experiencing is 100% real. Kane's newest book, In the Mouth of Madness, is about the end of everything, and starts where an evil returns to take over Hobb's End. The evil starts by taking the children, and then the people turn into creatures who aren't human anymore. She tries to kiss him as a way of persuading John to not leave and help her, I believe that this is Kane's way of kind of manipulating him. John notices the painting in the lobby has changed once again, and the people started changing into creatures. I love the movie's way of covering its tracks by having John check to see if the painting was manipulated by a human, but no, it actually really just changed. John questions Mrs. Pickman and asks if she's responsible for the painting, and she says hell no. And just the tone of her voice makes you think that something really bad is going on with it that she wants no part of. We can also look at the painting as a way of foreshadowing what's actually going to become our reality, where humans are turning into creatures. Things are really going wild here because Linda steals the car and leaves John stranded, and Mrs. Pickman's husband is on the ground naked and handcuffed to her ankle. So what kind of stuff are they into? So John is stuck here, and I love the notes that he's taking about Hobb's End, kind of saying that the people were paid off, and that they have visual effects going on. His character is written in a way that, even though he's very realistic, he's actually the insane one, kind of like Linda mentioned earlier. Reality has literally shifted to the sane people being insane. John Carpenter also kind of teased his future movie Village of the Damned with all the creepy kids in this town, which is a nice touch. Linda goes to the church and is approached by them, and they claim that she's their mommy, and today is Mommy's Day. The kids also start to mutate slightly. Linda investigates the church, and there are a bunch of upside-down crosses throughout, kind of like John's room in the asylum, except his crosses were upright. There's also some kind of substance on the wall, like a goo, which I'm going to assume is just the evil spreading that was mentioned in the book. Kane's office and desk are shown to be empty, and then when Linda shuts the door, we hear the typewriter. So he has appeared, and the room is actually changed. So while he was writing, he actually altered the world that we're in. Keep in mind Linda's words that reality is just what we tell each other it is. A jump scare hand pulls Linda into the room. While the jump scare earlier was perfect, this one kind of seems cheap and weird because it kind of just pulls her in and then the hand is gone. So Kane is actually excited to see Linda, telling her that she can edit this one from the inside looking out. Kane says that for years he thought he was making it up, but they were actually telling him what to write, and then we see a door shaking with black goo easing out of it. Jürgen Prochnow really nails the role, like he's this really crazed writer. Like if we didn't see the creatures trying to burst through the door, I could easily believe that he's just a crazed writer who has gone mad. I think it's very important to have the writer nail the role like this and not just rely on the monsters. He says all these horrible, slimy things, trying to get back in, were all true. He refers to his newest book as the New Bible and the Instrument of the Homecoming. One look at the text in the book draws that flashy 90s editing and shows us that it's enough to drive a person insane, perfectly capturing that Lovecraft trend of people going mad at the sight of Cthulhu. So Sutter Kane himself is actually turning into a creature, or at least a creature has attached itself to him. Back at the hotel, we see that John is in room number 9, which coincidentally, he has cell number 9 at the beginning of the movie. Linda shows up, having lost her mind, yelling, "I'm losing me," to John, and tells him to not read the book. In the lobby, the painting has officially transformed the people into creatures, once again showing us what will happen to humanity. John is also on the hunt for Mrs. Pickman and hilariously calls her an old bitch. Mrs. Pickman is revealed to have grown tentacles, and she starts chopping her husband with an axe just like in the book. I believe the caretaker attacking their spouse with an axe is an obvious nod to The Shining, just with the gender swapped and without the tentacles. K&B was responsible for the visual effects like the puppets and whatnot. The effects here could look cheap because they were done on a budget, but John Carpenter chose to keep the shots quick and in the dark, and I think it really works. Linda is revealed to be a monster too, but we only see tentacles coming from under the bottom of the bathroom door, and then she comes out like a human and attacks John off camera. I also love how she acts like nothing happened, like she didn't have tentacles reaching out from underneath the door. Filming Lovecraft is always tricky because his monsters work better in text since they drive people mad at the sight of them. So I love the choice to just kind of show these quick things, or not show them at all to make up for that. That weird creature with the snake arms that was supposed to be in the room in the hotel is now actually here, and I believe it's actually Mrs. Pickman, but I'm not sure. John tries to escape, but the streets are filled with kids surrounding Linda and singing that she is a dead girl. So the father from the little boy at the church earlier is sitting at the bar, questioning whether he came first or if they came first, meaning the otherworldly evil. John tells him this is not our reality, and the father says that reality is not what it used to be. So since the book has been completed, our reality is totally different. He then shoots himself, saying he has to because Sutter Kane wrote him this way. So fates are essentially sealed because of Kane's writing. John steals Linda from the mob, and she eats the car keys to stop him from getting away. He doesn't have time to wait for it, so he starts the car with a screwdriver and takes off. I also love how Sam Neill yells Jesus at her. He really has this great balance of fear, paranoia, and skepticism, and he does a great job at this role. Linda wakes up in the car as they drive off and confirms my thoughts earlier by saying that Kane is writing again, and he wants me to kiss you. So her kissing him earlier was actually the work of Sutter Kane. I love how we're just witnessing edits to a book in real time. So John pulls over and sees the old man on the bike from earlier. And just to add to how similar this is to Halloween 3, a very similar thing happens here too. Spoilers for Halloween 3, but as Dr. Chalice drives away with Ellie, we find out that she is a robot. And here, John drives off with Linda, and we find out she's actually one of the monsters doing this great Bray Wyatt walk, while their head is upside down. I'm really starting to think that this movie is just a loose remake of Halloween 3. John drives and finds himself back in Hobb's End, so he's pretty much stuck wherever Kane writes him. He loops back, even seeing Linda riding on the bike with the old man. John drives the car through the mob. When he's about to hit Linda, he swerves and wrecks the car. He wakes up in a confession booth where Kane himself is speaking to him. Kane says that no one has ever believed enough in religion to make it real, but the same can't be said about his own work. He's sold over 1 billion copies, and more people believe in his work than the Bible. Kane encourages John to read his new book, and it'll drive him absolutely mad. His work gets power from new readers and new believers. The more people who lose the difference between fantasy and reality will let the old ones begin their journey back. The old ones are the supernatural creatures and entities who have existed long before humans. Lovecraftian beings who need people to believe in them in order to come back to our dimension. Kane alters reality again, bringing John to the office where he finishes his novel, In the Mouth of Madness. Kane says that John will bring the book back to the world, and that John is whatever Kane writes. Hobb's End and John never existed before Sutter Kane wrote them into existence, which, like I said earlier, is why he seems like a character who doesn't quite fit in. That's also why Kane's agent tried to kill him earlier, because he read about him in the book, and he knew that John was destined to bring the book to humanity, and he was trying to stop him. So the axe-wielding guy from earlier was actually a good guy. A crazy good line here when John says he's not a piece of fiction, and Kane responds, I think, therefore you are. Kane sends John down a passage to enter our world because he can't hold the old ones back anymore. There are some great 90s effects here that actually didn't age too bad, where Kane rips himself as if he's a piece of paper and creates a void for the old ones to enter. Originally, this scene was supposed to be the town of Hobb's End being sucked into the other side, but it was too expensive to film, so they shot it like this. I love these shots of John looking through this ripped open book and into the void. So Linda reads a passage from the book, and it's exactly what John is doing. She says that the army of unspeakable figures started pouring towards him. The audience doesn't actually see the creatures, but John does. It's such a unique way of filming Lovecraft's unfilmable monsters. When John tries to escape with Linda, she reveals that she can't go because she read the end, which either means that Sutter Kane wrote her to not make it to the end, or she's too far gone and it's not worth for her to go. We actually do begin to see the monsters a bit, but in quick shots, so we don't actually really know what they look like. Together, these are what has been named the Wall of Monsters, designed by Howard Berger, and feature literal Lovecraft monsters like Dagon and Cthulhu. It took over 30 people to operate these monsters, so I just love the effort that went into making these creatures look good, even though they're only shown briefly. John runs down the passage that Kane left for him, and falls and wakes up on the road, which I'm not entirely sure how he would have just made it out like this, but oh well. A paperboy approaches him, played by Anakin Skywalker himself, Hayden Christensen, in his first ever role. The Star Wars prequels are actually something I want to delve into at some point, so stay tuned for that. Also, fun fact, one of Sydney Sweeney's first roles was in a John Carpenter film in 2010's The Ward. John drops Kane's book and leaves it on the ground. He also asks Hayden Christensen if he's ever heard of Hobb's End, and he says no, so that's a good sign. John hitchhikes back to a hotel, this time one not from a Sutter Kane book. He's watching 1953's Robot Monster, which Carpenter is a huge fan of. I always love how Carpenter incorporates Easter eggs of his favorite movies inside of his own movies. Despite not knowing John was here, he gets a package in the mail that is revealed to be In the Mouth of Madness. He burns the book and hits the road again. He's traveling via bus and dreams of Sutter Kane sitting next to him. Kane tells him that he's not going anywhere and that he's God now. Playing into the question asked earlier, when does fiction become religion? Kane tells him to look around, and when he wakes up, Kane asks him if he ever told him that his favorite color is blue. John wakes up with a blue hue all over the world. Everything is to Kane's liking now. When I mentioned earlier how Sutter Kane was altering reality because his favorite color was blue, well, John has blue eyes, and Kane's agent's eyes were split earlier, but also blue. The characters in his story all have blue eyes. Even the father of the kid in Hobb's End, he had blue eyes. The only one who doesn't appear to have blue eyes is Linda, and stay with me for a minute, and that'll make sense. So John awakens from the blue world to the real world. Honestly, I'm not sure what's the real world at this point. This movie does a great job of driving the viewer mad as well. On his way home, he passes by the Hobb's End horror ads again, and he rips it to reveal a poster with his face on it, further shoving it in his face that he's just a character in a book. John reports back to Jackson Harglow at Arcane, and he tells him his whole story. Here's where we'll get back into Linda's eye color. Jackson says that he sent John on this mission alone, and that there was no Linda. So Linda is basically different than everybody else because she never existed. John says that he destroyed the manuscript for In the Mouth of Madness, but Jackson tells him that that's not true, and he delivered the manuscript months ago. And In the Mouth of Madness has been out for 7 weeks already. God, I feel like this movie is driving me insane trying to keep up with it at this point. I think this only makes sense if you believe that Kane wrote the book this way, so he wrote John to have already delivered the book to humanity. Does that make sense? When John tells him to not distribute the book because it'll drive people insane, 1, it's already too late, and 2, the movie comes out next month. Fun fact, John Carpenter has a similar release date situation where he released his movie Christine the same year that Stephen King released the book. We hear news reports that In the Mouth of Madness is expected to break all previous publishing records. Coincidentally, there is an epidemic of paranoid schizophrenia. John is on the cover as the main character from the book. This poor kid bought the book, loved it, and immediately started mutating. His eyes are bleeding, and they are bright blue. It's kind of weird to see people buy the book and immediately read it as they walk out of the store. Like, do people do that? John hits the kid with an axe, and we cut back to his padded room where we can assume that's how he ended up here. John assures that Kane's message will spread with each new reader, and for those who don't read, there's a movie. He says it's safer in his cell, and every species can smell its own extinction. In 10 years, maybe less, humans will just be a bedtime story to tell kids. A myth. Looking back, I love how Linda told John in the car that if insane became the majority, John would end up in a padded cell, which is where he is right now. Whatever is going on in the world happens off screen, and John was right. It's safer in his cell because he's spared. It could also be because he didn't read the book, and when the creatures are outside of his door, he just looks away. Essentially, what is happening is that the creatures were released, either that or people became the creatures, and they are attacking the people that didn't read the book. So, a bunch of death and destruction. His door is knocked open and he's able to get out, though. An emergency broadcast says there are only a few stragglers left, and there are reports of people mutating and swelling and distorting. And this epidemic has spread to every country in the world. John wanders the streets to a movie theater where he sees that In the Mouth of Madness is now playing, directed by John Carpenter. Luckily, I guess the employees at the theater are still alive because the movie is screening and he's able to get some popcorn. John watches everything that we just watched. He's watching John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness. And all he can do is laugh and accept that he is just a character in a Sutter Kane story. We hear the creature sounds, and the knockoff Metallica music hits as the film ends. I'm curious as to what happens to John after the film ends because he only exists in the story. He could be in just a weird time loop where he relives the same story over and over again, or he honestly could just die when the movie ends. It's something that will never be answered, but it's honestly haunting to think about. Now that I've covered the entire movie, I want to point out how much I love that some of the covers of Sutter Kane books feature scenes straight out of the movie. The Hobb's End horror has the monster at Pickman's Hotel, The Whisperer of the Dark has the tunnel that Kane opened, The Feeding has the apocalyptic event that happened off camera of the creatures attacking humans, and Haunter Out of Time features a writer being haunted, which speaks for itself. Since In the Mouth of Madness, John Carpenter has directed 4 films between 1995 and 2001, before leaving Hollywood for a bit. He has since returned to direct 2 episodes of Masters of Horror in 2005, the film The Ward in 2010, and an episode of the show John Carpenter's Suburban Screams in 2023. Whether it was a lack of passion or whatever it was, many people consider In the Mouth of Madness to be the last great John Carpenter film. On IMDb, it's his only film since 1988's They Live to have a score higher than 7. For me, it's my second favorite Carpenter film, and it would honestly be my favorite horror film in a lot of other directors' filmography. We're talking like a top 20 horror film of all time for me. For me, my only complaint is that the movie feels like it wraps up really quick, like it could use an extra 5 or 10 minutes to breathe, but overall, I really love this film. I think the creature designs, although not shown often, rival the work in The Thing. In a world where parasocial relationships are very common, where everyone has access to everyone at almost any time, and a world where people worship celebrities and creators, the message behind In the Mouth of Madness hits very hard and is very prominent today. I'm not talking about someone summoning the old ones or anything, but the idea of mass violence, all because someone calls for it, is not out of the realm of possibility. If you've seen my videos on The Empty Man and Angel Heart, you could tell I love movies about a character who is doomed, and there's really nothing they can do about it. Sam Neill portrays the slow descent into madness perfectly, and ends it on a comedic note, laughing at the realization that he's just a doomed character. This movie really gets under my skin and makes me feel like I'm losing my mind trying to answer its questions. What is reality? And when does fiction become religion? So I'll pose my question to you.
Do you read Sutter Kane?